very beautiful day. I'm Patrick Mahaffey, and I welcome you all here to a very special occasion, the dissertation defense of Felicia Chavez. So it's a very, very big day in her life. The defense marks the end of a period of sustained liminality, and that means that the work that has occupied Felicia's life for a great deal of time is now being released, and that opens up a space for the next phase of her life journey, a new chapter, not in the dissertation, but in her life. It's typical and perhaps unavoidable that we distinguish between the inner and the outer worlds, or between spirituality and ecology, for example. However, it is one thing to distinguish and differentiate, and quite another to dissociate two things that are ultimately connected and inseparable. As the title of Felicia's dissertation indicates, she conjoins the themes of spirituality and sustainability and specifies the common principles and the common threats that pertain to both. And I want to call attention to the fact that Felicia's research is not just scholarly and intellectual. It's deeply grounded in her professional work with the environment. She earned a Green MBA before coming to Pacifica, and the spiritual practices that inform the way she lives, thinks, and sees the world. In a word, her practice cultivates what she and her teacher calls vision. And finally, I want to note that most dissertation writers encounter the unexpected as they pursue their work, events that could easily derail the process, and Felicia was no exception. Her father suddenly became ill and passed away as she did the research and writing. And I salute her for bringing her work to fruition, even as she experienced the deep grief of her loss. I feel certain that her father, and many others, certainly me, are proud of what she's achieved. So, without further ado, please present your work.
So, sustainability and spirituality, common threads and common threats. Once upon a time in high school, I stood in a classroom pondering the destruction of the environment by my species, human beings. At that time, I came to the decision to study psychology because I thought that if I understood the human psyche better, then perhaps I could understand how it could be that the human species could see fit to destroy the very fabric of life on which our own species and individual lives depend. However, a BA in psychology did not help me to answer this question that was driving me, which was essentially, what is wrong with us? An MBA in sustainable business presented me with many important insights, but not an answer to this central question. Approximately 13 years after that, I found myself on a spiritual path. Through meditation and all manner of looking deeply into myself, I began to gain a much more clear insight into others. I had a front row seat into what is wrong with me and what is right with me. Through a combination of long-term study of environmentalism and sustainability, combined with first-hand spiritual experiences, I started to notice common themes between sustainability and spirituality. So what ended up happening is that I decided to come to Pacifica to gain an in-depth understanding of a diversity of religious and spiritual traditions in the context of the Mythological Studies program. This study has enabled me to document where these common principles appear across a wide variety of traditions. So there are three main structuring assumptions underneath my study. One is that if you look for the underlying principles that define the sustainable worldview, you will discover that not only are these principles found in spiritual and religious traditions, but they actually arise from these traditions. Moreover, we find these principles in their most alive and compelling and beautiful expressions in spiritual and religious scriptures, texts, and teachings. And I call these principles that are found in sustainability and spirituality common threads. Number 2, just as there are common threads, there are also what I call common threats. And I frame these as the polar opposite of each common thread. Generally speaking, I frame the common threads as life-supporting and the common threats as life-degrading. We will review the principles and their opposites in a moment, but first, number 3. My working hypothesis is that in order for sustainability efforts to ultimately truly work, spirituality is required. That is, sustainability must reground itself in spirituality. And as we will see, what I mean by spirituality is really firsthand spiritual experience. What you find in ecological science and sustainable business in particular is that, with some exceptions, a few important ones, the rhetoric remains well inside the materialistic reductionist framework, or boundary, or worldview. And I claim that that boundary needs to be broken down, and quickly. So I've reviewed a bit about my background and the assumptions that I work under for this dissertation. But before I move on, I want to highlight a quote from Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now, that when I read it, I really took this quote to heart. And it informed what I have done with this study. Quote, "The pollution of the planet is only an outward reflection of an inner psychic pollution. Millions of unconscious individuals not taking responsibility for their inner space." So I'll leave that quote for now. Just let it be in the background as we review the study. And we'll begin with an overview of the structure of the study, and then we'll take one principle, oneness, and look at it in depth. So the way I segmented sustainability was into ecological science, sustainable business, and activism. And the way I segmented spirituality is based on William Payton's book, Interpreting the Sacred, and he has these categories: traditions of Indian origin, in which we would find Hindu traditions and Buddhism, Abrahamic traditions, including the 3 we would think of, and East Asian traditions, including Taoism and Confucianism. I think I draw from Taoism quite a bit and only Confucianism just 1 or 2 times in my study. I added Native North American traditions to segment some area for indigenous studies. And then I added alchemy, Gnosticism, and modern spiritual teachings as well, because I needed a catch-all basket for some more esoteric traditions that personally I'm more familiar with. So a brief overview of the principles that I looked at in depth in my study include oneness, living simply, purity, and care and heart. And then their polar opposites, as I frame them, are oneness versus fracturedness, living simply versus compulsive consumption, purity versus pollution, and care and heart versus antisocial tendencies. And there's 3 additional ones. I have 7 total. And I just dealt with these briefly in the summary chapter of my dissertation. And they are awakening, preservation of life, and awe and wonder. And as you might imagine, as you look at these, in reality, all of these operate as a system. There is often significant overlap between them, and we'll look at some of that overlap later. And maybe there are some that I have missed that I have not noticed. So now we'll look at oneness, beginning with sustainability. And I have, for ecological science, before I get to that, I wanted to read a brief quote from a systems thinking book called The Systems View of Life. And throughout the dissertation, I reference systems thinking. So this is the brief quote. "The sense of oneness, which is the key characteristic of spiritual experience, is fully confirmed by the understanding of reality in contemporary science," unquote. And so Barry Commoner, who put together the 4 laws of ecology, for him, number 1 is that everything is connected to everything else. He was an ecologist. For activism, my example is Julia Butterfly Hill. And I have a longer quote from her that I will read. And for those of you who don't know, she lived in a 180-foot tall redwood tree for over 2 years to protect it from being cut down, and she named the tree Luna. And she almost lost her life a few times with helicopters buzzing her and in giant storms, and it's very dramatic to read the book. I learned firsthand how everything that we can or cannot see is interconnected like strands in this web of life. From the microorganisms in the soil helping feed nutrients to Luna, to the stars that are billions of light years away, and everything in between. Living the way I live, I've learned how each thread reaches back to us. And then my example for sustainable business is this logo from the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI. And what they say briefly about sustainability reporting on their website is they claim that 92% of the world's largest 250 corporations produce sustainability reports of some kind. And that of those, the GRI is, quote, the world's most widely used standard for reporting. And this is what they say about their logo. The connected dots of the GRI logo, which form the shape of the world, symbolize the important elements of our organization: connectivity and collaboration. We believe that we need a global perspective to change the world. Our new logo is an amalgamation of all those beliefs and values. Now, at breakneck speed, we're going to go through approximately 12 different spiritual/religious traditions and quotes from each one of those, just to get a kind of gestalt of oneness across a wide swath of traditions. So to begin with, from Eknath Easwaran's translation of some of the Upanishads, from the Isha Upanishad, for him who sees everywhere oneness, how can there be delusion or grief? And from Buddhism, this is Thich Nhat Hanh, the heart of the Buddha's teaching. Cause and effect co-arise. Co-arising goes beyond our concepts of time and space. The one contains the all. And from Islam, and specifically Sufism, this is a longer quote that I'll read. When the Quran asserts, everything perisheth save his face, the Sufis understand this truth as referring not to some future eschatological event, but to the here and now. At this very moment, which is also the eternal now, everything is non-existent and has perished in itself, save the face of God. And right now, in whichever direction one turns, there is his face. If one could only see. To understand this reality is to realize the meaning of the oneness of being. And from the New American Bible, 1 Corinthians. As a body is one, though it has many parts, and all parts of the body, though many, are one body, so also Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free persons, and we were all given to drink of one Spirit. And from Judaism and Kabbalah, God is one. God's secret is one. All the worlds below and above are one. Can I get through all of this spiritual literature? It took me 2.5 years. Divine existence is indivisible. Moses de Leon. And from Taoism. I've been reading all of this like quietly to myself at my desk for a long time. Now I'm reading it out loud. Where that and this cease to be opposites, you'll find the hinge of Tao. And in the yin-yang symbol, there's this, symbolic impact of unity visually. That's from Chuang Tzu. And for Native North American traditions, I have a quote from a modern teacher, Melissa Nelson. And this is a longer quote than what you'll see on the screen. Our biological and psychological space is a communal ground, a commons. As much as human thought and Eurocentric conditioning tries to divide and fragment us, we are ultimately part of an undivided wholeness. With this profound philosophical and ethical understanding, indigenous peoples have taken it upon themselves to be the caretakers of the last remaining healthy, sacred, biodiverse places on Earth. Because they are us, we cannot be separated from these places. And from Alchemy, a short excerpt from the Emerald Tablet. As all things were, by contemplation of one, so all things arose from this one thing, generally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. From Gnosticism, the one is without boundaries. Nothing exists outside of it to border it. The one cannot be investigated. Nothing exists apart from it to investigate it. The one cannot be measured. Nothing exists external to it to measure it. That's from the Secret Book of John. And a quote for Modern Spiritual Teachings from The Power of Now in Eckhart Tolle. In the timeless realm where God dwells, which is also your home, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, are one, and the essence of everything that has ever been and ever will be is eternally present in an unmanifested state of oneness and perfection. Now we'll skip over from oneness to fracturedness. And again, I have a quote from Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now, just to summarize fracturedness briefly. Identification with your mind creates an opaque screen of concepts, labels, images, words, judgments, and definitions that blocks all true relationship. It comes between you and yourself, between you and your fellow man and woman, between you and nature, between you and God. You then forget the essential fact that, underneath the level of physical appearances and separate forms, you are one with all that is. So then, in the spirit of systems thinking, I asked the question, what would low-mode oneness look like? So if you're seasick, you might not want to look at the screen for a moment. So first I have a quote from, again, The Systems View of Life, which is by Fritjof Capra and Pierre Luigi Luisi. Fascist societies function more like an organism, and it is not a coincidence that dictatorships have often been fond of using the metaphor of society as a living organism. Some qualities of low-mode oneness: conformity, groupthink, homogenization, and I call it boring. And again, you might want to look away as we zoom back out. And then, of course, the question, what would high-mode fracturedness look like? So, if we take the fract part of the word, we can think of fractals. And thanks to Wikipedia, even though these JPEGs lose resolution as we zoom in, we have a series of them that clarify as we go deeper into the fractal. And I like the fractals, not just because they're beautiful, but even though I didn't talk about them in my dissertation, they kind of help to communicate some of the points I was making in my dissertation about high mode fracturedness, and then later on in the conclusion. The fractal illustrates the paradox of the oneness principle, simultaneous unity and diversity. Diversity is a prerequisite for life. High mode fracturedness is not brokenness. It is a paradox that says that in some mysterious way, greater diversity equals greater unity. This is not strange to those who study ecosystems, and nor is it strange to mystics. And then just to take a look for a moment at the interlinking nature of the common threads, and I will support a few of these links with quotes, but not all of them for time considerations. The relationship between awakening and oneness. This is a quote. Mechtild of Magdeburg said that the day of her spiritual awakening was the day she saw and knew she saw all things in God and God in all things. And Mechtild was a 13th century mystic and woman in the spiritual movement of the Beguines. And then when you have an experience of oneness, it is wonderful and inspires awe. And then it also opens your heart. And for the relationship between, let's see. And when it opens your heart, then you have more access to what your heart is experiencing as opposed to just your head, for example. And then it's more available to care for others and for the planet, we could say. And the relationship between care and heart and purity, I have a quote from the Dhammapada of Buddhism. Purified of separateness and reborn in the love of all life. And of course that speaks not just to the relationship between care and heart and purity, but also to purified of separateness, to the oneness principle as well. Oops. And then oftentimes people, to purify themselves, they divest themselves of material wealth. So that's the relationship, as I'm framing it, between purity and living simply. And then I have a quote for the relationship between living simply and preservation of life at more of the horizontal material level. Most materials flowing through industrial economies, in the United States the share is 95%, in China 88%, are non-renewables. A stark contrast to pre-industrial societies, whose economies were dominated by wood, water, plant fibers, animal skins, and other renewable resources. Unquote. That's from State of the World, 2013. So I'm suggesting that there is an obvious link between living simply and use of renewable materials as opposed to the opposite. And then I have a quote from it's one of the Upanishads, Shvatashvatara Upanishad. Quote, to know the unity of all life leads to deathlessness. To know not leads to death. And so in that, I'm providing a little window into the fact that in my interpretation of preservation of life, we can both speak at the concrete level in terms of individuals or species, but also this much bigger infinity level of deathlessness as spoken of in the Upanishads. And of course, in reality, there are connections between probably all of these different principles. So just a few comments about mysticism. All of the common threads are found largely in traditions that are inherently mystical or in the mystical branches of world religions. An unexpected outcome of this study was accumulating a list of themes or principles in common across mystical traditions, not necessarily in reference to sustainability, but just across a great variety of spiritual traditions. A few of these include fire, truth, beauty, nous, or intelligence of a different order, language as inadequate for expressing experience, the primary importance of one's state of consciousness over and beyond one's actions, the presence of paradox, and love of others through recognition of the one in all. And finally, vision, a method of inquiry that transcends materialistic limitations conventionally placed on communication and knowing, and that both occurs spontaneously and can be enhanced through training. I define mysticism, much like spirituality, as personal spiritual experience. However, I also like this definition from Matthew Fox. He says, "Today, I like to tell people that mysticism is about not taking for granted. An ecological awareness is therefore a mystical awareness. Not taking health or healthy air, water, forests, soil for granted." I conclude my dissertation with the point that Native North American groups have cultural knowledge that is utterly essential to sustainability work. This knowledge imparts an inherently spiritual or spirit-filled worldview. This is a quote from M. Kat Anderson in her book, Tending the Wild. One cultural universal was that food was never taken for granted. A gatherer asked the plant for permission to gather its parts, and gathering was followed by prayers and offerings of thanks. At the end of the harvest season, ceremonies were often held to thank the rains for nourishing the earth, or the black oaks for bearing heavily, or the Canada geese for returning, unquote. At the very end of my research, I was referred by someone who read an excerpt of my summary chapter to a model called Theory U. Those who developed this particular model, in particular Otto Scharmer, work out of MIT, and one of the major pieces of the Theory U work, which is a systems thinking model, is the imperative of helping a system to become conscious of itself. They also make the following point. The quality of a system is directly dependent on the quality of the consciousness of the participants. Referring back to Eckhart Tolle, that inner pollution equals outer pollution. One's quality of consciousness has direct relevance to the health of social and ecosystems. This is both a spiritual principle and a sustainability imperative. Thank you.